Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and this is yet another video in my series on Paulo Freire. Today, I will still be talking about Chapter 4, in which Freire first discusses four anti-dialogical concepts and their practice. We have covered pretty much all of them, and today I will be covering the concluding part of the fourth concept, which is cultural invasion. After Freire had discussed these four anti-dialogical concepts and their practice, he will then go on to articulate and discuss four dialogical concepts and their ramifications, which I will cover towards the end of this chapter. So, as always, thank you for joining me. Please do subscribe if you haven't already to the channel so that you get timely updates. Now, I will first read the passages from chapter 4 and then come back and we'll talk about it. So, here we go. Cultural invasion further signifies that the ultimate seat of decision regarding the action of those who are invaded lies not with them but with the invaders. And when the power of decision is located outside rather than within the one who should decide, the latter has only the illusion of deciding. This is why there can be no socio-economic development in a dual reflex invaded society. For development to occur, it is necessary A, that there be a movement of search and creativity having its seats of decision in the searcher. B, that this movement occur not only in space, but in the existential time of the conscious searcher. Thus, while all development is transformation, not all transformation is development. The transformation occurring in a seed which under favorable conditions germinates and sprouts is not development. In the same way, the transformation of an animal is not development. The transformations of seeds and animals are determined by species to which they belong, and they occur in a time which does not belong to them, for time belongs to humankind. Women and men among the uncompleted beings are the only ones which develop. As historical, autobiographical beings for themselves, their transformation development occurs in their own existential time, never outside it. Men who are submitted to concrete conditions of oppression in which they become alienated beings of another, of the false being for himself, on whom they depend, are not able to develop authentically. Deprived of their own power of decision, which is surmounting the contradiction in which they are caught, they become beings for themselves. If we consider society as a being, it is obvious that only a society which is a being for itself can develop. If we consider society as a being, it is obvious that only a society which is a being for itself can develop. Societies which are dual, reflex, invaded, and dependent on the metropolitan society cannot develop because they are alienated. Their political, economic, and cultural decision-making power is located outside themselves in the invader society. In the last analysis, the latter determines the destiny of the former. Mere transformation, for it is their transformation, not their development, that is to the interest of the metropolitan society. Okay, so let's unpack these passages, right? Now, as we have been reading Freire, we know that we have to be careful about what he considers beings in themselves, right? I mean, the term, I think, comes from Erich Fromm, but I haven't been able to locate the exact book from which it comes. So what he's highlighting in these passages that I just read is the nature of development itself, human development. Now, of course, this term is bandied around in word circles all the time, right? Transformation and development. What's the distinction that he's making? That's important for us to keep in mind. Now, when he talks about a seed propagating or animals growing, there is physical transformation of their state, but that comes from outside. That's natural. The difference between human beings and animals and inanimate things is that the human beings are capable of thought and they are capable of reflection, right? And they are aware of their conditions and want to change them. The distinction that he's making is that whether or not what any human being or a group considers their transformation or development, is it coming from their own free consciousness, or are they still not capable of thinking for themselves? This has been our struggle throughout this book to define, articulate, and understand how to create and work in life as human beings whose thoughts are not appropriated by an outside force, right? Because then any change that they will bring will come from their own critical consciousness as a group and as individuals. So right now what he's setting up as development, let's say, in the world and transformation, what he's saying is that most of the time, even if there is transformation in the world or development in the world, it is still in the model of the thinking processes and interests of the dominant groups. I mean, this is an insight that is still relevant today. So how many reform movements have you seen, or how many government reforms are being introduced in the governments and states of the global periphery? Most of the times, those reforms are at the behest of powerful institutions or nations outside that want to control that territory and its people for their own interest. Now, the reason people see this development not necessarily as not in their interest is because the system of thought and logic that dictates their lives is lodged inside of them, right? That's what we have been trying to eradicate by reading this book and trying to figure out what are the ways of eradicating it. So if we go towards the final part of these passages that I just read, if we consider society as a being, it is obvious that only a society which is a being for itself can develop. Okay, so this is what I would call the organismic view of society, society as a living thing, right? So if society changes as a living thing, it will only be true change if the change comes from within the logic of its own people, their own understanding of their conditions, and the change in their collective interest. If the change is being performed, right, or brought about, but at the back of it is the interest of another dominant group outside, then it is not true transformation, true change, or development. That's roughly my understanding of this passage or these passages. But as I said earlier, I apologized. I don't have my books with me and I could not find the exact reference to the Erich Fromm book. But keep in mind that for Freire, kind of like Marx, the idea of human subject that he imagines is a human subject that is alienated, And alienation, you know, people try to make it into a deeply complex concept, but alienation basically, to talk about it and to explain it, we have to understand how Marx understood the figure of the human. So for Marx, there is a central being. We all have a central being, and we have our natural truths and natural identity, a centered identity. And we are homo faber, right? We love to produce and make things. An alienated person is a person who is dissociated or disconnected from their true purpose or what they are supposed to do. And instead, they have to go and do mundane things, repetitive things to earn a living. That is the concept of alienation and alienated labor, right? So, an alienated person in this sense, in Freire's sense, then, is a person who is not in touch with what their conscious and critical desires are. They are alienated from that self because that self that they carry is generated and created by the oppressive system within which they exist. That's roughly my understanding of it. So let's read a little more and then come back and conclude this section. It is essential not to confuse modernization with development. The former, although it may affect certain groups in the satellite society, is almost always induced, and it is the metropolitan society which derives the true benefits therefrom. A society which is merely modernized without developing will continue, even if it takes over some minimal delegated powers of decision, to depend on the outside country. This is the fate of any dependent society, as long as it remains dependent. In order to determine whether or not a society is developing, one must go beyond criteria based on indices of per capita income, which, expressed in statistical form, are misleading, as well as those which concentrate on the study of gross income. The basic elementary criterion is whether or not the society is a being for itself. If it is not, the other criteria indicate modernization rather than development. The principal contradiction of dual societies is the relationship of dependency between them and the metropolitan society. Once the contradiction has been superseded, the transformation hitherto effected through aid, which has primarily benefited the metropolitan society, becomes true development, which benefits the being for itself. For the above reasons, the purely reformist solutions attempted by these societies, even though some of the reforms may frighten and even panic the more reactionary members of the elite groups, do not resolve their external and internal contradictions. Almost always the metropolitan society induces these reformist solutions in response to the demands of the historical process, as a new way of preserving its hegemony. It is as if the metropolitan society were saying, let us carry out reforms before the people carry out a revolution. And in order to achieve this goal, the metropolitan society has no options other than conquest, manipulation, economic and cultural, and sometimes military invasion of the dependent society. An invasion in which the elite leaders of the dominated society, to a large extent, act as mere brokers for the leaders of the metropolitan society. In analysis of the theory of anti-dialogical action, I wish to reaffirm that revolutionary leaders must not use the same anti-dialogical procedures used by the oppressors. On the contrary, revolutionary leaders must follow the path of dialogue and of communication. So here we are at the end of the section on cultural invasion, the fourth concept and practice that Freire discusses under the anti-dialogical theory. And in the passages that I just read, he now expands the nature of development and our understanding of it beyond individual and community to the global relationships and the myth of development. So, what we just read, what becomes deeply clear, and it's so insightful what he's writing, is that most of the times development is seen as material development, roads, infrastructure, right? And those are the indices that are reported in The Economist and elsewhere. What he's saying is that that is not the measure of the transformation and development of any given society. Because most of the times these changes are happening at the behest of powers that be. They have reached a certain threshold. They need to at least point out that there is some reform going on to negotiate a new hegemonic order. Now, the true development would be in which the people of a given peripheral territory decide for themselves what is it that they want, how would they achieve it, and when what is being reformed and developed is in their best interest and builds up their societies. Now, what Freire is highlighting is how the international powers, even now through a local elite whose interests are governed by the dominant metropolitan powers, right? How do they create an illusion of development? And even when that development happens, people's lives do not change. And people's lives do not change because the development is still being done in the best interests of the metropolitan power. So think of all the countries right now, including Pakistan, that are performing or introducing reforms to match the IMF demands. Now, IMF, if you've watched any of my lectures on it, is an imperial institution. They are beholden to their shareholders, and those are the powerful nations who give them the funding. So anytime they come in and want a government to introduce reform, that reform is neither asked by the people nor is something that's there to take care of them. The purpose of that reform is to make sure that that nation remains stabilized so that IMF's investment is not lost. Now, the idea is that, yeah, if the country follows IMF's mandate, their lives will improve too. But since it is an outside institution trying to impose reform on a different society, and since they have their own interest in it, it is not true development or reform. So by the end of this passage, where he's concluding his discussion, right, of cultural invasion and the four anti-dialogical concepts, there is a cautionary note, right? There is a cautionary note for the leaders of the movement, right? That if they are going to bring change and talk about reform and development, it has to be from the point of their own society as a being for itself and not a society that exists for the interest of another, for the interest of the global dominant forces. That's where he leaves us with a cautionary note for revolutionary leadership, right? And from here, he will go on to then give us four concepts and practices that he considers instrumental and necessary for dialogical mode of thinking and dialogical action. So now we have concluded the four anti-dialogical practices that he talks about in the beginning of chapter 4. Cultural invasion was one of them. Manipulation was another one, right? And there were two others which I'm currently forgetting. But if you follow the lectures up to now, we should now have a clear understanding of the four anti-dialogical concepts and practices, and that knowledge will now allow us to understand the four dialogical practices and ways of thinking and ways of living. And I'll be back with a conversation on that pretty soon. All right, that's it. I hope you liked it. Please let me know what you think. And as always, I would love to have your support. I would love to have your suggestions. Feel free to add those in the comments below, and I'll try to respond to them. That's all. Thank you so much. Please stay safe, take care of each other, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.